Hi everyone, Dave here. Hope you're going well. And I'm here with my friend Lewis. G'day, Lewis.
Hey,
And as you know, we're going through the book of Genesis for the first 12 chapters anyway. And there's so much that's in there, so much we could talk about. One of the issues that often comes up is how do we reconcile science with what is taught in the book of Genesis? Now, Lewis, can you share for us some of your background, both in terms of your professional training and personally in faith?
yeah, sure. Well, I'll go in the order you asked. So my professional training originally was in physics and astrophysics. And that was I studied over in the U.S. and did a PhD in astrophysics there before coming over here to Australia to do some research at UNSW. That was kind of my initial academic training, and then I migrated over into Christian work, and in the process of that, I also did a theological degree here in Australia. So I have that background as well now.
Yeah. So,
Yeah,
bona fide scientist and a cool scientist of that astrophysics doesn't get to be with
that's
that.
right. Yeah.
And actually a qualified Christian minister, as you like. And I should say, a Christian minister who actually brought Hugh and I together, but that's another story. So, long-time friends. What are you doing now? Can you tell us about your ministry, your work now?
Yeah. So I work with the Australian Fellowship of Evangelical Students. That's they're my employer, and so that's the tertiary Christian student organization that runs around the country. Work on different campuses, and my role is kind of in the org chart of AFES. My role is kind of like a national specialist for the non-undergraduate ministry, PhD students, professional staff, academic staff at universities around the country. So I'm based here in Sydney. In fact, I'm based just up the road at the University of New South Wales, and have been for 23 years. But yeah, I have this kind of national role within the organization to help promote this sort of ministry. Yeah.
Great. So if you are on campus and you're a postgrad or staff member, we should introduce you to Lewis. But anyway.
That's right.
And so even more reason to chat to you about this topic, right? Because I imagine as you talk to postgrads about the Bible, this often comes up. Christians themselves thinking through the scriptures, you would have thought lots about this in your ministry as a scientist and so forth. So thank you, Lewis, for joining us. And we're just going to chat about kind of the issues that arise when we think about Genesis and science. So it's been very broadly like that.
Yep.
So can I start with kind of a very basic, everyday kind of thing, right? So if someone said they're going to read the Bible, they open up the Bible, they start reading at Genesis, and they say to you as a believer, how can you believe this stuff? I mean, it's so clearly wrong according to science. What would you say?
Yeah. Well, at one level, I would say kind of yes. Like that is the story that you read doesn't sound a lot like the story, right, that you get from the university, from the university science class or whatever. Sure, absolutely. So, I mean, I think one thing is we do need to recognize, right, that the text of Genesis doesn't resonate with us in the same, with our kind of education that we get in class, right? Whether it's in primary school, high school, whatever. So I think we got to recognize that. But at the same time, I guess I'd also want to ask that person, well, what do you think someone thought 3,000 years ago when they read Genesis chapter 1? What would it sound like to them? Would it sound like it was scientifically out of this world, or historically false, or what would they get out of it? What would be their reason to read it in the first place, and what would they then be able to get out of that text? I think that, to me, that would be a question I'd want to ask, because I think that's got to factor at some level into our own way that we approach the way it sounds to us.
So I mean, sort of respecting the fact this is a historical document that at some stage had a first audience, and actually going, let's think about what the author might have intended to communicate firstly to them, and then work from understanding it from there. That kind of what you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. And without wanting to say at all, this has no historical relevance, or even at this point, no scientific relevance. I don't feel like, I don't want to say that, but that's not the issue, right? The issue is thinking through. There are different issues involved with getting something out of the text and thinking, how does this match with my current understanding of science? So
it's just sort of proper reading, in a sense, kind of what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, and you could, like, look, it's called, Genesis is, the first of the 5 books of Moses. And so you could think, okay, well, if Moses is sitting down to write this, well, what is Genesis chapter 1? What is the first few chapters? Well, it's an introduction to the book of Moses. What is, what's he talking about by the end of the book of Moses? Going into the promised land, talking about removing idols, not worshiping idols, but worshiping the God who brought them there, etc. Well, what is Genesis? Well, maybe Genesis 1 is more about, against idols or something like that. I mean, we just really need to think more broadly and carefully about the history of the text and so on. Yeah.
Putting its proper context. Cool. Yeah. So that's very helpful. And just say, we've done a sincere attempt to read it in its proper context and so forth. And I think some people then try to sort of show how it sort of fits, with what we know from contemporary science. So what do you think about that sort of approach?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, I'm not a big personally, I'm not a big fan of that approach. That's not how I think about Genesis and the opening chapters there. And there are a couple of reasons for that, but I mean, I think, there's the kind of what you might call young earth approach, where you're saying our understanding of mainstream science probably has gotten this wrong. And, really this is describing 6 24-hour days, 4,000 years ago or something like that, 6,000 years ago, 10,000, whatever it is. And that's one kind of way of trying to make it fit science. That is kind of to say science hasn't gotten this right, and there's better science that would actually get it right. But then there's that kind of almost, I don't know, it's a different approach. It's not really a middle of the road approach. It's a different approach where it says, actually, when you look at Genesis and the way that the story unfolds in Genesis, it actually matches with the kind of order of things as mainstream kind of current science says they developed. Oh, okay, well, that's interesting. So Genesis, maybe really this is, it's figurative in one sense. It's picture language, but at the same time, it is outlining a real historical process that's unfolded on the earth. And it is, and you can match it up. Oh, the first, so the kind of day age sort of way of approaching things, each day in Genesis is a long age, billion years or whatever you want to put in there. But you can see that there is some kind of correspondence between the way Genesis unfolds in the kind of natural history, I guess, and the way science describes things. So I mean, so there is that kind of correspondence there. I mean, which is fair. I think that is a fair point. It's not my preferred way of thinking about it.
Well, so I suppose the question is like, and I think you were hinting at this before, what do you think is the best way to read it? So we're sort of saying, you shouldn't try and make science from it. There's probably some issues with trying to sort of massage them together. I think you're hinting at it before. What would you say? What's the best way to read Genesis?
Yeah, look, I would say this. Genesis, like, I'll just keep saying Genesis 1, but I mean, look, any opening chapters there of Genesis is an ancient Near Eastern document, right? I mean, that is what it is. And it's an ancient Near Eastern creation document, like story, right? That's what it is. Fundamentally, that is the nature of that document. Now, it just so happens that because it was written by the God who in fact created everything, it happens to be true and correct in what it teaches. It's different in that sense from all the other ancient Near Eastern creation stories. But in terms of its human kind of nature, it's very much an ancient Near Eastern document. And so I think we read it as such. What do we expect? What do the people of that age expect to get out of it? And I think when you read the other creation stories from that age, what you see is it's a description of the gods, the origin of the gods, the origin of humanity, and the relationship and all of creation, and the relationships between those things, and a kind of statement about the way the world, like why is the world the way it is now? That's effectively what you read about in all these other stories. And when I read Genesis 1, that's what I get out of it. I get this picture of God, but not a God that's been created. In fact, in the beginning, God, right? Like, so you get, God wasn't created by some event or volcano or something else or whatever, right? God was there from the beginning. Everything that came from God, etc. Anyway, so you get this picture of who God is in relation to his creation, including his human creation. And I think it's just a really incredibly helpful document.
Cool. So maybe sort of trying to lock into what its concerns are, and running with that rather than kind of all our different
rather than importing things like our questions in a sense. Our questions aren't necessarily wrong. The question is whether this document is going to answer them or not, right? It's not that we have bad questions. It's just we may not ever. This document may not be tailored to answer them. That's all.
I might have thought about it once as saying it's like looking for oil in a gold mine. Like, science is great. There's good questions there, but it's not where you're going to find the answers. Cool. Now, you said, look, it's in the end, it is true. It's from God and stuff. And maybe it sort of comes back to what you just said. But how do we sort of reconcile the fact that we want to say it's true, and it is, in some sense, it's giving us a record of history. But there are talking snakes. There's, in the flood account, there's this ark that somehow manages to get all the species, even if it's just in pairs. How do we kind of reconcile that with truth, if you like?
And that's a massive. I mean, that's a really helpful question because. Because there is all that stuff there, and yet, and I want to say, I mean, this is my personal kind of take on it. I want to say that on the history question, I want to say Genesis, creation week. So give me up to, let's say, 2 verse 3 or something like that, is not history. I want to say that is actually a kind of introduction or an overture, maybe all the themes of the symphony that are about to unfold or something, but that's not history in the sense that we think of it at all. And yet I do want to say Genesis 2 verse 4 to the basically the story that ends in Revelation 22 starts in Genesis 2 verse 4. That's my personal feeling. And so I want to say no, I want to attach that story to history, very much so. But I also want to say that we've got to think more carefully about how different people throughout history have recorded history. And so, just quick example. So, 2 things from Matthew chapter 1, what I'm saying about history starting at Genesis 2 verse 4, Matthew chapter 1, I think actually points us by using that little phrase, this is the account of, that actually points us right back to Genesis 2, verse 4, where it first gets mentioned in the Bible, to say this is the beginning of the story that Jesus finishes in that whole genealogy, you know, of Jesus in Matthew chapter 1. And so I want to say that, yeah, I think, you know, Matthew really wants to say that's where the story started, in some sense.
Yes.
And it's connecting right through to real history that we know of, you know, through all sorts of other means, right?
Yeah.
But on the other hand, when you get to Revelation, let's say chapter 12, for example, you get this picture of this woman with a crown of 12 stars on her head, who's in labor, giving birth. And there's this dragon who's the devil, who's waiting there to snatch the child, like to grab the child when he's born. But then somehow, before the dragon gets the baby, God grabs the baby and whisks the child up to heaven, where this child is going to rule the nations with an iron scepter, right? And so on. And you think, well, hang on, like, I know that story. Like, I know what's going on there. That's the birth of Jesus. Mary with the crown of 12 stars. That's kind of the nation of Israel, and it's Mary, and who rules the heavens and the earth with an iron scepter? Well, it's the Messiah, the Son, right? You know, like, and so what you've got in Revelation, I think it's verse 5, chapter 12, verse 5, maybe. In one verse, you have the entire story of the birth, life, ministry, death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus, right?
Yeah.
Recounted to you. And yet there was a dragon there at the birth of Jesus, and Mary didn't. I don't remember the dragon, you know, from Matthew's account or Luke's account, you know. And you know what I mean? Like, that is like, of course, this is a historical event. This is describing an event that we all know happened in history. And yet, if you were at that event with a video camera, you would not have seen the dragon, right? There was no dragon. Mary didn't have a crown of stars on her head, right? Like, you know what I mean? Like, history, it is real history. Like, it's talking about real things that have happened on this earth, right? And yet, it's describing them in ways that are trying to communicate all sorts of other things beyond the actual historical events that are taking place. Yeah, that's right. And I just think we have to be fair to the Bible. Like, if we agree that the Bible can record history that way, then why couldn't it record history that way in Genesis chapter 2 or Genesis chapter 10 or whatever? You know, I just think we've got to be fair and let the Bible talk the way it talks, you know?
Yes. So just to see if I'm hearing right. So I think this is saying it's recording history, but it might be depicting history in a pictorial. I mean, one of the things I think is difficult, we don't sort of have a genre to go, this is this genre or whatever, but it seems to be, it's true, but it's recording things in a way that is a bit more metaphorical, figurative than what we might prefer, perhaps, or something.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, and fundamentally, it's largely, I mean, because it's not, its primary aim is not exactly to convey history. It's saying these things happened, but this is what these things mean. Like, this is, and so it may have imported all sorts of things, like a dragon waiting at the birth of Jesus. Yes, I mean, I'm sure Satan was kind of there and wanted to, you know, remove this child. I'm sure, right? Like, right? But if you were one of the shepherds, right? You didn't see Satan. You know what I mean? Like, you didn't actually notice Satan, when you were standing there. And that's because, I mean, we're talking about different reasons for recording these things. And so, that's how I feel. You know, the first chapters of Genesis kind of pan out, really, in terms of history. It's
almost, I mean, I hear what you're saying about Genesis 1 being an overture and sort of a big picture of, in a sense, everything. Like, you can almost summarize history that way. But in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, they're both in the beginning setting, but they're different angles, aren't they? Like, it's sort of hinted right there, aren't we? We want to say they're both true,
Yeah, yeah.
They're both different ways of saying the same thing.
Yeah, I agree. And people will try to do some fancy things with Hebrew to say that Genesis 1 and 2 aren't sort of contradictory timelines and stuff. But I honestly, I think it's pushing the point a bit. And I mean, so you get to the end of Genesis, of creation week, and day 7 doesn't have an evening and a morning. There is no end to day 7, at which point you want to say, well, then when was day 8? You know, in terms of the timeline, like if you want to be serious about that kind of mapping out the timeline, which is fine to try, it's just that I think you come against some real issues there when you try to map out a timeline.
No, that's good. That's good. We have a list of questions here, mate. This is very helpful, and I might skip it. But maybe if I just throw in this one, what do you think about evolution? What do you say about evolution?
Look, I think evolution is a fair way of compiling the current evidence for the origins of complex life on this planet. Okay, that is, I believe that everything that's happened on this planet, including everything that happens in my life and beyond, is that God is behind it all. That nothing happens without God's action behind it, in a sense, as the primary cause of everything that happens. But also there are cause and effect happens in the world as well. Like we can see secondary causes at work in the world as well. And science, what science does is describe those secondary causes, right? It looks around the world and goes, oh yeah, this caused that, and so on and so on and so on. Here's the chain of things down through the ages or whatever. And evolution is one of those things. So science has kind of gone, okay, here's a bunch of data, here's some bones in the ground, here's some genetic information, here's all this data, and it's gone, what story can we tell that will actually kind of be the most consistent one we can come up with that incorporates all this data we've got, and you go, okay, evolution. And currently that's like what you'd call the neo-Darwinian synthesis of change over time coupled with genetic inheritance and so look, I just think it's probably the best description we have of the evidence that we have in front of us. Of
how God did it, rather than so. I've heard people. I think you agree with this. We don't believe in things accidentally, randomly kind of mutating and so forth. But
no.
saying if we're trying to see through science the way God's done it, evolution is a fair way to describe it. Is that?
Yeah, that's right. And that's exactly what I would say. And I would say, but just keep your finger in that page of the book, because things may change at any moment, right? Like don't get wedded to evolution just because it's the current best scientific explanation for something. That's a recipe for disaster. And when I say don't get wedded to evolution, I mean, and one thing I mean as well is don't start nailing your theology to evolution. Don't start trying to understand God from the perspective of evolution. This is how God does this or that, or God is a random chance and time God or something like that. Nothing like that at all, right? Not at all. Like we do not use our current scientific theories to kind of back, reverse engineer what we think the nature of God is. No, the Bible tells us what God is like, and there's nothing in evolution that tells me anything different. It's just this is the way God has used physical processes to make things happen the way He wants them to happen. I mean,
it struck me as I prepared to preach Genesis 1 this week. that the Bible, in Genesis 1, it is teaching so much about who God is, and there's so much richness there. And, like we talk about getting a big idea to preach. Well, there's kind of like, easily a dozen probably ideas there that are so profound and big. And so we don't, very thankfully, we don't have to sort of look at the world and try and figure out God, or like it's revealed for us, isn't it, in the scriptures? So it's really hitting those big, profound questions that ultimately.
And look, and I should say as well, like, I mean, you asked the question at the beginning, like, someone picks up and reads it and they go, this is just scientific rubbish. Like, what is it? How can I trust the Bible? And I think we need to keep in mind, I wish I could draw a diagram for everybody. I should have prepared ahead of time. But like, God wrote the Bible, right? It is the Word of God. It is the objective. It is the one. There is one objective perspective on the world in which we live, and that is God's perspective. And that's recorded. Some of that perspective is recorded for us in the Bible. And so if you really want to find out the way things are in the world, look at the Bible. But God also wrote the book, as it were, of creation. Some of the 17th century philosophers used to talk that way, right? Like the two books of God, the book of his word and the book of his works. And so God did both of those things. They are both, in a sense, objective realities, right? They exist independent of our minds and the way we think about things. And because they are created by the God who is a unity, they are not in conflict with each other, right? The reality of creation, the true nature of creation, and what's recorded in the Bible, those things are not in conflict with each other at all. They cannot be, virtually by definition, from a Christian worldview. As God, the creator of both, they are not in conflict with each other. But as soon as you hit the human level of things, right, we are reading the Bible and trying to understand what it means. And we bring our whole kind of subjective reality, not the objective reality. We bring our subjective perspective to reading the Bible. We look at creation as scientists or historians or whatever field of knowledge you're in, and we try to understand creation. And we bring our subjective perspective to understanding creation there, and we're gonna get things wrong. We're actually gonna get things wrong about God and the Bible. That's why we have preachers. That's why we have Bible study groups, right? That's why we encourage people to read the Bible, because we're always actually growing and changing in our understanding of God. We always get things wrong, and we can always do better, right? So we keep reading the Bible. But the same thing with science. We get things wrong all the time. Of course we do. And we're trying to get better and better and get a better understanding. But because we're below the kind of interpretation line, in a sense, we're not in objective world, we're in subjective world. When we interpret creation and then we interpret the Bible, those two things are in conflict with each other sometimes. Because we get things wrong sometimes about the Bible. We get things wrong sometimes about creation. And so there are presenting problems between these things. They don't all fit together all the time, right? And so sometimes we throw our hands up. What are we supposed to do about this? So, but we've got to remember we're in subjective world, right? Not an objective world. And objectively, they don't conflict. Subjectively, they might, and they probably will. But we've got to be humble. We've got to sit loosely to this and enjoy what God has done, enjoy what we learn, and not get too stressed about these things.
That's very helpful. So I think, so you're saying we're going to be humble and recognize that there are points at which we just don't know, right? Both in terms of understanding the Bible and understanding science, and instead of kind of grasping for, well, this is the way it is on these points we don't know, like actually sitting with the fact, well, there's Bible's saying this, but I can't quite figure it, but that's fine. Like there is enough clarity in the Bible to actually have a confidence of this is what it's saying. But you're saying we don't want to overreach in terms of and I think. That's right. And I think, we also want to be careful when we talk to other people, whether believers or unbelievers, but in particular,
believers, our brothers and sisters, we want to have a really healthy dose of humility when we come to either side of this equation, whether we're reading the Bible with other believers or we're talking about science with other believers. Like, we have got to admit at all times, at least to ourselves, we don't know everything. And this friend here may actually be right, and we need to be able to have a happy, loving, gracious conversation, because the important thing is Jesus, not not the things we disagree about.
This is great, Lewis. And I wonder if like people tune in, they might have questions. So I wonder if maybe we could come back next week. Maybe, I don't know. Well, can I just see what comes back? This
sure.
So, but maybe just finally just to wrap. Well, maybe session 1. We'll see.
Yes, right.
So you're a scientist, you're a Christian, been so for many years. Why would you still be keen to study the Bible? Sorry, to study the book of Genesis now? What would you say to that? Why would you still be keen and enthusiastic to study it?
Wow, yeah, that's look, that is such an easy answer, right? Because every time I read it, I discover new things in the text. Like, it's just a treasure trove of beautiful stuff about God. It reminds me about the precarious kind of nature of the human condition. It reminds me every time I hear the serpent say, "Did God really say?" I mean, it honestly just like cuts right through me. Like, I just think, yes, I do doubt the word of God. Please forgive me. Because it didn't happen back there. It happens every day of my life. The serpent is saying, "Did God really say?" Every time you're making even some of the easiest decisions, what should be easy decisions about your life. And I just think, no, like, this is the most brilliant sort of setup and reminder of really kind of what God wants for us and what has gone wrong. It is so clear. And if we get creation wrong, we will, I promise you, get the gospel wrong. We will downplay the effects of sin. We will always ask the question, well, why did Jesus really have to die? Like, if we don't get creation right, the fact that God is not like us, and yet he has done so much for us, and he's given us everything we have. Anyway, I won't keep going. If we don't get it right, we will get the gospel wrong. And I just think, no, we have to get it right. And so we have to keep going back. And every time I read it, I learn new things and am challenged again and again. I'd keep doing it all the time. But yeah.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Lewis. That's very helpful as we embark on this journey of Genesis 1 to 12. As I say, it's been very helpful. If possible, maybe we'll come back and have a sequel if people want to send their questions in.
Yeah. And let me say to your congregation, Dave, there's another PhD scientist and theologically qualified person in your midst as well. So actually, there's not just one. I'm pretty sure there's actually several of them in your congregation. So I'm happy. I love talking with Dave, and I'm happy to do this anytime. But
excuse for us to catch up, Loss.
Yeah, push your own resources as well. Yeah.
All right. Well, yes. Okay. We'll see. But thanks so much, mate. And,
great, excellent. And I'm available next week. So.
Thank you, Loss. Excellent. Okay.
All right. Great. See you, Dave. Thanks. Bye.
Okay.